week is this idea of courage in the face of our fears. And I thought before we get started and diving into the story that we would just take a few moments to pray. And part of our time together in prayer, you know from week to week, there are various ways that we as a community pray together. Sometimes we carve out time and we just celebrate. We just give thanks for the good work that God is doing in our lives. Sometimes it's more confessional. There are things in our heart and our lives that maybe shouldn't be, or things that should be that are not, and we have a time of confessional. Today is more a time for us to acknowledge the things in our lives, honestly, that are troubling us, that are creating a sense of fear. In the early prelude portion, I read Psalm 34, and we talked about how no matter how far you get in life and how much you grow and mature, that you will always have, fear will always be with you. It will always come and knock at your door and try to make a home, really, but it's the end result of our responsiveness to those fears in terms of how they will impact us is what we do with them. And so this morning what I want us to do is just to be still for a few moments, to think about our lives, to think about the things in our lives that might be creating some sense of dread, some sense of fear, things that are troubling us. And then I'm going to lead us in a prayer together after just a few moments of quiet that's up on the screen. And if that prayer expresses the desire of your heart, then I want you to join me in that prayer. So I just want us to take a few moments, if you would, to join me. Let's just be still. I want you to look at and listen to your life. And if there's stuff in your life that you need to you just need to bring before God, then I would invite you to do that. Because we don't need to be a people who worry. We don't need to be a people who stress out. We don't need to be a people who obsess. We need to be free people. No matter what's going on in our lives, we need to be free. And the way in which we find freedom is by making good choices in the face of our fears. So let's just take a few quiet moments, and then I'm going to close us in prayer. And if you want, you can join me in that prayer. I would imagine in a room this size that there are a lot of fears swirling. And I just pray this day that you would be speaking to us even right now. That in light of the size of our problems, that we would see you and the bigness of your size. To know that you are greater than any issue or trouble we face these days. That your arm is not too short to save. That you see us, that you hear us, that you are concerned about our lives. So God, this morning we just honestly bring before you those things that trouble us, those things that are causing us fear. And we're going to just pray this prayer together, asking you to meet us as we do. Father, the obstacles before me and too much to overcome. I'm easily discouraged and even afraid of what I cannot comprehend. Yet you have commanded me to be strong and courageous in the face of my fears. Help me to see my obstacles and problems as you do. Breathe into me the courage to choose faith this day, that I may understand what it is to rejoice even in the face of my fears. I want to be the kind of people who rejoice in the face of our fears. Don't you? I do not want to be moved. it is a very present reality that troubles come our way. I just want to make good choices. And I think you do too. We're going to talk a little bit about that this morning. But before we jump into the Conquest of Caanan in chapter 7, if you've not been with us, this year we've been wanting to know the Scriptures better. We determined that there was a gap between believing that it's important to read the Bible and actually then reading the Bible. That we know it's a good thing to do, but we don't often do it. And so what we did at the beginning of the year was we introduced to our fellowship this book called The Story. And the story is a chronological journey from the beginning of the Scriptures in Genesis all the way through Revelation. And it's done in the form of a narrative. So the book is 80% Scripture and 20% transition to take you through the Bible so that it makes sense in narrative form. It's also chronological. And so where we find ourselves today is chapter 7, and the children of Israel, after 40 years of wandering around in the wilderness, and those who had no faith dying out, the next generation then moving in and taking the land. But before we hit that, I just want to hit one spot at the end of chapter 6, which I didn't get to last week, and just dialogue with you about it for a second. You can find it on page 88 at the top. This is what I want us to begin with. This is the death of Moses and God not allowing him to enter the promised land. I just want to speak to that for a moment. On that same day, the Lord told Moses, "Go up into the Abarim range to Mount Nebo in Moab, across from Jericho, and view Canaan, the land I am giving the Israelites as their own possession. There on the mountain that you have climbed, you will die and be gathered to your people, just as your brother Aaron died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people. This is because both of you broke faith with me in the presence of the Israelites at the waters of Meribah-Kadesh in the desert of Zin, and because you did not uphold my holiness among the Israelites. Therefore, you will see the land only from a distance. You will not enter the land I am giving the people of Israel." Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land. And then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said I will give to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Okay, just by a show of hands, how many of you guys think this is just unfair? You read this story and you're like, really? After all Moses did for all this time, you show it to him? Kind of like, here you go. No, you can't. Does it trouble you a little bit? Does it seem a little harsh and even cruel? I think as I read this story and just kind of sit with it for a little while, I mean, at first glance, it seems a bit harsh. I mean, Moses, for a long time with a tough group of people, was faithful. I mean, most of the time, Moses did what was asked and required of him, and even went the second mile and third and fourth and fifth. My esteem of Moses, as we've walked through the story, has only increased greatly in stature. But he gets to this place where God is disciplining him because he asked him to do something. Now, when God asked Moses to do something, he was at the end of his life. He was about 120 years old. He had been walking with God for 80 years, or he had been really following God in a very real way for 80 years. And he comes to this place where the children of Israel are finally on the edge of glory. They're ready to enter, and he just loses it. Now, Moses, we know, has had a problem with anger his whole life, and he's sort of got it under control, but enough is enough for Moses. He loses it, and he bangs the rock rather than speak to the rock and ask for water to come out. And what I have to say here is this. The promised land for Moses was secondary. If you will look at and listen to his story. Now most of us, because we're goal-oriented, we want to get to that place. That was secondary, really, in nature. Moses wanted. What Moses wanted was God's presence in his life. In fact, there's a place in Exodus 33 where, or maybe even prior to that, where God is saying, listen, I'm going to lead you guys up to the land of Canaan. I'm going to let you go in, but I'm not going in with you because you've been stiff-necked and resistant and proud, and I don't want anything to do with you. I'm going to let you go, and I want you to lead the people in. And Moses said what? He said, if you're not going with me, I don't want to go. I refuse. If you will not go with us, then I don't care about the promised land. Because really all I've ever cared about is you and your presence. And as you see at the end of the bottom of page 88, Moses had it in spades. There was never anyone closer to God, the scriptures say, talking face to face with God. Such closeness and such intimacy that was cultivated over the years, and as God takes him up on the mountain range, Mount Nebo, looking over into the promised land, he shows him glory, and he helps him to see where the children of Israel will one day go. And I would imagine like sort of an old couple sitting on the porch reviewing the years of their lives together as Moses is about to pass, that they had some great time. Now you will know in Moses' character that Moses, whenever he had a problem with God, he didn't mind speaking his mind, did he? He always was willing to speak his 2 cents. But as God tells him, listen, this is the land of promise. The children are going to go in, but you're not going to go. There's just silence. There's no response from Moses. He doesn't cry. He doesn't beg. He doesn't plead. He doesn't do anything. He just kind of sits with God and he accepts that. And I think Moses had really, really what he wanted. I mean, Moses is sitting on a mountain with God talking as they're reviewing his life as he's getting ready to die. God even buries Moses. I mean, God is so close to this man. Moses has everything he wants. And the reason that he disciplines him, I believe, is because they're right here. They're right on the edge of glory. And this leader who has been leading so faithfully for a long time basically just loses it in front of them. And he sets the tone. I mean, the leader always sets the tone for his people. And if God doesn't discipline this action, what are the people going to do the next time they hit a hard spot? God does not play favorites in this regard. He instructed Moses. Moses did what he shouldn't have done, and God had to discipline him. But I think more than anything, I think Moses got what he wanted. Because really, hands down, God's presence, if you look at it and listen to his life, is what he most wanted. Now, if you're not all that happy anyway still, and you still think it's unfair, in Matthew chapter 17, and Mark chapter 9, and in Luke chapter 9, there's a story where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up to a mountain, the Mount of Transfiguration. And when they get to the top of the mountain, this is the promised land, right? When they get to the top of the mountain, who is there with Jesus, and Peter, and James, and John? Who appears? Moses and Elijah. So if you're not happy about the fact that he doesn't get in now, truth be told, he gets in because he's there with Jesus on the top of the mountain in the land of glory, the land that he and his ancestors were promised. So don't feel too sorry for Moses. It seems like a bum deal, but at the end of the day, he gets everything he wants, and also he inherits the land of promise. So that being said, I want to jump in now to chapter 7 and the actual conquest of Canaan. Moses dies, and Joshua, along with a new generation of people, they're camped right outside, on the other side of the Jordan. They're camped right outside the land of Canaan. And they're ready to finally enter and take a land that had been promised to them over 600 years earlier. It seems like a long time for a promise to come and be fulfilled. Let me read to you page 89 of the story. This is God speaking to Joshua. Joshua needs a little pep talk before he leads the children of Israel into the land. And so God says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give them, to the Israelites, I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Does anybody get the sense that there's a recurrent theme running through this little pep talk from God to Joshua? What is it that he says 3 times?
Strong and courageous.
Be strong and courageous. Now, why would you tell somebody to be strong and courageous no less 3 times? I mean, he said it once, he said it twice, he said it 3 times. Why would you ever say such a thing to someone? Because they're totally terrified. They're incredibly afraid. Now, what does Joshua have to be afraid about? Right? I mean, why is he at this spot now? God has him on the verge of entering this place that 600 years before had been promised. What does he have to be afraid about? One of a few things I would say. Number 1, Joshua has never been the leader. He's been in Moses' shadow for a long time. Moses has had to toe the line. Moses has been the one who's had to have the face-to-face with God. Moses is the one who's had to intercede on behalf of people. Moses is the one who had to deal with all the complaining and grumbling. Moses is the one who had to lead out in tough spots. Joshua was his assistant. He was a leader, but not the leader. And now he is the leader. There is a big difference between being the person where the buck stops and just somebody else as a part of the team. The buck stops with him now. And he knows what has happened. He has been a part of this group of people who have had to wander around faithlessly for 40 years until an entire generation has died out. He has seen it all. He came through the Red Sea and saw God's provision. He saw bread and quail come from the heavens to feed them. But he's also seen, not so much even with the miraculous, but he's also seen how the people have complained and grumbled and at every turn been faithless. How they've been disappointed to God. And now he's responsible for leading this group of people. So that's the first thing. But the second thing he has to be afraid of is the land that he is getting ready to enter is actually occupied. And they're not going to really take kindly to a group of people coming in and saying, hey, time's up, your lease is up, it's now our turn to take your homes and your animals and your property. Time to go. You remember back 40 years when the spies were sent out that they were terrified to enter the land, that there were giants, they said, in the land. Right? The giants are still there. Joshua is petrified because he's now the leader, but he's the leader of a group of people who have not really shown themselves to be all that strong and courageous, who have at every turn, when faced with moving forward, moved backward. And now he's going into a land filled with giants that he is supposed to get rid of. So I don't know about you, but this is enough to engender fear. We were just thinking about the fears in our life. This would create a little fear in mine. I don't know about you. So he gets to this place where God gives him these instructions and he tells him, listen, just relax. Be courageous. Be courageous. Be courageous. Be courageous. And his knees are all going to go, okay, all right. He gets the instruction from God and then he gives some to his people. Now, how do you imagine the people are going to respond to the instructions that Joshua has given to them? Okay? This is the next generation. I mean, their parents didn't do a great job. You think they're going to do a little better than their parents? Listen to what they say. Joshua gives them the instructions about what they are to do. Then they answer Joshua and they say, Whatever you have commanded us, we will do. And wherever you send us, we will go. Sound familiar? That's what their parents said. They said, they didn't do it, but they said it. And then they say, just as we fully obeyed Moses, so will we obey you. Oh, really? Just as we fully obeyed Moses, we will obey you. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. It's like the Lion and the Wizard of Oz with courage, right? And they say, only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Okay? So they're right on the edge of glory. They're getting ready to enter the land. Joshua then secretly sends out 2 spies. He learned from the time before when Moses sent out 12, and 10 brought back a bad report, and he and Caleb were the other 2 and brought back the good. So he secretly sends out 2. All he needs is 1 for a majority. And if it doesn't work out, it was a secret and nobody knows, so he's going to do it anyway. He just wants to get a feel for what's going on in the land 40 years later. And what they find out when they come back is that the people in the land are actually scared to death of the Israelites. They've heard a lot of stories about what God has been doing on their behalf, and the scriptures say the people in the land were melting with fear. You ever melted with fear? They're totally afraid. This time the tables are turned. Last time they're like, we're like grasshoppers, we're like little bugs in their sight. Now it's like the tables are turned. They're afraid of us. These giants, they've heard about how big our God is and what he will do. They're scared to death, okay? So, he gets this report back, and he then has 2 things that he needs to do before he enters the land. This is at the bottom of page 91. Now, before they can enter the land, there are 2 barriers that separate the Israelites from the promise of a homeland. The first is the Jordan River. It's a formidable barrier in an era before span bridges. Now, it's springtime and the Jordan is at flood stage. I don't know whether you've ever been at a river when it was flooding, the water's over its banks. It's pretty ominous, right? Water is a very powerful force, and so they're going to have to cross this. They don't have any boat. They don't have any bridges. They're going to have to walk through this. Does this remind you of anything they've had to do before? They've got another body of water to walk through. This time it's the Jordan at flood stage. Okay, so that's the first barrier. The second is this rite of circumcision, the sign of God's covenant with his people. None of this generation had been circumcised. And it's one thing to be circumcised a couple days into your life. It's another thing to be circumcised 20, 30, 40, 50 years into your life. This is an obstacle and a barrier and a time where men in this congregation go, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years old, time for the circumcision before we go in. Well, Joshua organizes the march of the land, and with the Ark of the Covenant leading the way, when the priests were carrying the sacred Ark, touched the riverbank, the Jordan's brisk flow ceased. All the people crossed on dry ground. Once camped on the other side, the circumcisions were performed. Now, if you can imagine Joshua trying to give this speech before, this is his first order of business as the new leader, right? Okay, so we're going to take the land, we're going to finally move in, but there's a few things that we need to do first, okay? First, you see that river over there, that one that's like, white water? See some whitewater rafting going on over there? We're going to have to cross that. And they're kind of just sort of blankly looking at him thinking, how are we going to do that? He said, and when we cross that river, I want you to meet me in this big tent and bring with you your flint stone. No stainless steel scalpels, no anesthesia, because we've got a little surgery we need to do. So once we get through this raging river, just meet me in the tent, bring your flint and a few Band-Aids, and we'll talk about the next step in the journey. So he tells them about the rite of circumcision. I just have to tell you today, I am so glad that as a part of the new covenant, that the sign of the covenant is baptism, not circumcision. for these guys, this would be the sign of their identity as a new people, a people of God, if they were to be circumcised, because this generation had not been. Okay? So he goes there, and then he performs the circumcision. They're laying around the camp for a few days. They're recovering, recuperating. And then he gives the battle plan. Now, here is what the battle plan is going to be. Let me read to you from page 92. Now, the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out, and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. And on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them, sound a long blast on the trumpets, and have the whole army give a loud shout, and then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, everyone straight in." Okay? So we've got to cross this raging river, we've got to do this little circumcision thing, and then the battle plan is what I just read you. Basically, the battle plan is this. You're going to march around and you're going to make a lot of noise. And they're like, and then? And we're going to march around and make a lot of noise. Now, I don't know about you, but how do you sell this? How do you possibly sell this to a group of people who at every turn have seen God provide for them, but at every turn have responded in a way where they allowed their fears to dictate their decision making? How do you sell this? The truth of the matter is, this plan makes no sense at all. I mean, how could you possibly imagine that after crossing a raging river with no boat, doing your circumcision, which puts you in a very vulnerable position, taking your trumpet, I mean, it resembled more a marching band than it did an army, and walking around once a day for 6 days, and on the 7th day, 7 times, and then blowing these trumpets loud, and these big, high fortress walls, they're going to just tumble and fall. It doesn't make any sense at all, does it? What was God getting at here? This is something that will be important for you to know. This is a place where your story will connect, believe it or not. What is God getting at? I think simply this. There will be times in our lives where God wants us to understand that the battle is won by He who goes before us. He does not want the Israelites to be convinced that it was because of their clever strategy or their conventional warfare or the power of their weapons. He does not want them to think that in the might of their own strength they were going to take this land. This was the first battle, and it was representative of what they would need to know for all of the rest of the battles of their life. And that is the only way that this was going to happen was going to be by the provision of God's hand. It was going to have to be a miracle. And God was going to have to do it. God was going to have to fight for them. Because they didn't have weapons. They had trumpets. And so I want you to just think at this point right now, there are places in your life where we understand that Joshua is being called to step up into a new place that he's never been before. And I would imagine these days that there are at least some of you in this place that God is speaking to about stepping up and facing something that's going on in your life that you have allowed to dominate you for days, weeks, months, maybe even years of your entire life. God is calling you to a new place in your life. He's calling you to step up. And you can't possibly see how that's going to happen. All you see is a raging river. And all you see is a huge fortress wall, thick and sturdy and big and high. And you can't imagine or envision how it's going to happen that you're going to overcome these obstacles and take this land. It might be in your family that God is calling you to step up. It might be in your workplace. It might be here in this church or in the community with neighbors. There is some place in your life that you are right now looking at, and God is speaking to you about stepping up and moving forward and not moving back. And I just want you to think about this place right here when they enter and take Jericho. It doesn't make any sense at all. You're not going to think your way out of stepping up. It's going to be because God is at work in your life, and He goes before you and provides for you in a way that you couldn't have possibly done yourself. So if you're in that place where God is really prompting you to step up these days, let me say to you, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. I say to you again, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. If God is calling you to step up, then step up. This is a place where our story connects with their story. It makes no sense at all. But from the very beginning, God wants them to know who is Lord. And it is not them. They will not win because they're good fighters. They will win because He is for them and He is with them. Listen to what happens. They execute the battle strategy. It says, when the trumpet sounded and the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed, so everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They are finally in. This is the first conquest, but it will not be the last. They will move in, as the book of Joshua tells us, and they will go throughout the land from beginning to the end. They will start in the south, and then they will move north. They will go east, and they will go west, and they will completely eradicate. They will completely annihilate their enemy. They will take over this land that they have been waiting to take over for 600 years. They will divide, and they will conquer, and they will take the land. In chapters 13 to 21, Joshua will parcel out the land, and he will divide it out according to the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. And he will, in doing so, give each according to the promise of the fathers who had come before them of what had been portioned out. Now, one of the things I want to stop and read to you, it's not found in the story, but it is in the larger story. In Joshua chapter 14, in Joshua 14, I want to read to you the plot of land that is parceled out to Caleb. Does anybody remember Caleb? Remember who Caleb is? Caleb was the second spy 40 years earlier who had gone with Joshua to look at the land. And Caleb, like Joshua, thought that they should have gone in then. But Caleb, like Joshua, had to spend 40 years of futility wandering out in the wilderness of unbelief until that generation died out. Well, Caleb is now 85 years old. And Caleb's going to have a discussion with Joshua that I want you to listen to, because there's something really important here for you to hear. You can find this discussion in Joshua chapter 14, beginning in verse 6. It says, a delegation from the tribe of Judah, led by Caleb, son of Jephunneh, came to Joshua at Gilgal. Caleb said to Joshua, remember what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, about you and me when we were at Kadesh Barnea? I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land of Canaan. I returned and gave from my heart a good report. But my brothers who went with me frightened the people and discouraged them from entering the promised land. For my part, I followed the Lord my God completely. So that day Moses promised me, the land of Canaan on which you were just walking will be your special possession, and that of your descendants forever, because you wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God. Now, as you can see, the Lord has kept me alive, and well as He promised for all these 45 years since Moses made this promise, even while Israel wandered in the wilderness. Today I am 85 years old, and I am as strong now as I was when Moses sent me on that journey. And I can still travel and fight as well as I could then. He's 85. So I'm asking you to give me the hill country that the Lord promised me. You will remember that as scouts we found the Anakites living there in great walled cities. But if the Lord is with me, I will drive them out of the land just as the Lord said. So Joshua blessed Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and gave Hebron to him as an inheritance. Why does this matter? The dude is 85 years old now. And he's having this conversation with Joshua, the only other one that expressed faith when time called for him. And he's saying to him, listen, you may think I've gotten older, and I'm not quite as spry as I once was, but I got to tell you, I'm as strong and as virile and as vibrant as I've ever been. And he says, you know what? You know that hardest place that I told God that we could take, the one with the giants in the land that had the biggest, strongest fortresses? He said, when you're parceling out the land, that's the one I want. Send me to the hardest possible place. He's 85 years old. Do you think he'd be looking to slow down a little bit, take it easy, maybe find an easier place that would be a little bit more comfortable to settle? Caleb is who he's always been. Because the choices we make when we're 20 and 30 and 40 will shape who we become when we're 50 and 60 and 70. Why could Caleb at 85 have that conversation with Joshua? Because he had that conversation with Joshua and Moses when he was 40. So here's what I want to say to you about the choices in your life. Guard your hearts and make good choices. Because if you exhibit and express fear at 25, you know what? When you hit 55, it's only going to be greater. If you are a person who lacks self-control when you are young, it will only make sense that you will lack self-control when you grow up into an older adult. We will just become older versions of what we already are. Why? Because the choices that we make take us to the places that we go. That's why when Caleb hits 85, he's like, you know, come on, punk, make my day. Right? Give me the biggest, hardest, toughest assignment. I'm ready, let's go. Why? Because he said, God's on my side. And he always has been. And even if these guys had to die out in futility, I'm still here, I'm still standing, and I want what I wanted when I started. So you might not think that the decisions you make these days impact and affect too much who you're going to become. But let me tell you, if you string enough of them together, you will set a precedent for the character that exists in your life. And I want to ask you this. As you are growing older, who are you becoming? You know what? You get to choose. You make the choice. There's a lot of bad stuff that's going to happen in your life if it hasn't already. There's a lot of bad stuff that's going to come your way. And when I look at Caleb and I look at his response to the bad stuff that's come his way, he could be very sour after wandering around for 40 years and something that wasn't his fault. But he's ready to go. Lace him up and let's go. Because he knows who God is, and he's sure by the power of God in his life that he can tackle any obstacle in front of him. He's a courageous man at 85 because he was a courageous man at 40. And so I just want you to think about your life and your life's choices. If you're whining and complaining and mumbling and grumbling at 20 and 25 and 30 and 35, do you think it's going to get any better when you're 50 and 60? We've seen this play out in our families, haven't we? The harder you are when you are younger, you will incredibly become even more hard as you get older. I want to be like Caleb. I want to be like Caleb. If God gives me 85 years, I want to be ready to go. Just courageous and faithful because I've seen God do it in my life and I trust Him. Not because I think that I have anything great to offer, but because I know God is with me and for me. You want to be like Caleb, or do you want to be like a generation that died out because they just couldn't see it? Anyway, I think it's important, and that's why I jumped there for a little bit. Guard your hearts. Make good choices these days. When tough times come your way, don't use it as an excuse to be a negative person, a cynical person, a depressing person, an angry person, a fearful person. Don't use your situations and circumstances as an excuse to make a bad choice. if you're looking for a place to make a bad choice, you will find many of them. Perhaps you need to look to make a good choice. And while you might not be able to do a lot about the things that you have done, and the places you've been sidetracked along the way in your past, you can do something today. The instruction I'm giving you is not easy, but it's simple. Choose joy. Choose hope. Choose faith. Choose trust. It's the uniquely Christian response to trouble. Choose them. Well, Joshua portions that land out to Caleb, and he gives out the rest of the land. And he's going to give one final farewell speech just before he dies at the end of Joshua, just like Moses did before him. But before we get there, I want to address something that we find in the book of Joshua that is probably the most difficult part of the Scriptures that there exists in all of the Scriptures. Many people read this part of the Bible and they view God to be harsh and cruel. I mean, God sends the Israelites in, and he basically says to them, I want you to destroy the entire land. I don't want you to leave not one infant. I don't want you to leave anyone or anything. I want you to go in and destroy everything. It's troubling, right? I mean, because we have this understanding of God, largely through the lens of a New Testament Christian God through Christ, as a gracious, loving, patient, kind Father, right? And so we read Joshua and we're like trying to square in our minds, how does this God work with this God? Is it two different ones? Is there an Old Testament God and a New Testament God? And I will say to you, they are one and the same. They are not two different gods. Now, let me tell you, as I explain to you, just my understanding of this text, that if my explanation of this dilemma doesn't satisfy you, it doesn't fully satisfy me yet either. This is a place where I'm still wrestling and learning and growing. So maybe if you hang around for 10 years, I'll have learned a few more things, and we will all be the wiser for it. So just bear with me. This is hard stuff. Of all of the places in the Scriptures, this is a difficult place for me also. Now, more than 600 years, before the conquest of the land, when God first promised to make Israel a great nation, he set the conditions for the land that he would give them to build their nation. I want to point you to a passage in Genesis chapter 15. God is having a conversation with the granddaddy of them all, Abraham. And he says, in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites lived in the land, has not yet reached its full measure. In other words, he's saying they're bad, but they're only going to get worse over time. I have not brought about my full measure of justice on these people, because there is a chance that perhaps repentance can occur. Okay? So there's this long period of time where there's silence. But in the beginning, he's saying, this land that I'm going to give you, it is occupied by an evil people. But their evil has not yet reached its peak. Now, some of the things that these people did were incredibly detestable in the sight of the Lord. And I want to just read to you from a couple places in Deuteronomy, just so that you have a context and a background for what's going on here with this people. It'll just give you an understanding. You may not like it anymore, but I just want to help you understand what's happening. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, it says this, that it's a warning to the people who are going to occupy this land that the Amorites, Canaanites, Jebusites, Hittites are all occupying. It says, do not fall into the trap of following their customs and worshiping their gods. Do not inquire about their gods, saying, how do these nations worship their gods? I want to follow their example. You must not worship the Lord your God the way the other nations worship their gods, for they perform for their gods every detestable act that the Lord hates. They perform every detestable act that the Lord hates. So I would imagine if they do everything under the sun that God hates, there's a lot of stuff going on that's just not cool. He goes on to say, they even burn their sons and daughters as sacrifices to their gods. It was common practice as a part of their worship. In other words, he says, don't get in the land and ask them how you do your worship. Because how they do their worship is they offer their children. They burn them in the fire to their god Molech. They have no idea what they are doing when it comes to worship. They are wild and raucous. They prostitute themselves to many gods. Every detestable thing that you can possibly think of, they do. And so he says, don't take your cues from them. Okay? In Deuteronomy, there's also a place where he says, after the Lord your God has done this for you, giving you the land, don't say in your hearts, the Lord has given us this land because we're such good people. No, it's because of the wickedness of the other nations that he is pushing them out of your way. It is not because you are so good or have such integrity that you are about to occupy their land. Could it be possible that they would think that it's on their own merits that they get to enter this place? It could be possible. That's why he's telling them, listen, it ain't because you're so hot, because you're not so hot. We've seen that over and over again. It's because their wickedness is so great, and I can't take it, not another moment. It is evil, pure evil, all the time, 24/7 evil. We've got to eliminate it. Why? Because I have a dream for a people and a place that will draw and attract others to me. And this is standing in the way. He says, the Lord your God will drive these nations out ahead of you only because of their wickedness, and to fulfill the oath he swore to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You must recognize that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land because you are good, for you are not. You are a stubborn people. Just in case they didn't get it the first time, he was reminding them again the second time. Okay? So here's the deal. God has a dream to create a called out, set-apart people. And as he builds and creates this nation, and time is going on, the space that they will one day occupy is currently occupied by a group of people who are wicked and evil. And at the time where he speaks to Abraham, he says, they're not just that bad yet. But as time goes on, they get worse, not better. Finally, their evil reaches a certain place where God says, it is enough. And we need to get rid of this. Now listen, when we go into, and other countries go in and take down harsh dictators, everybody knows that's a sense of justice. It was called for, and if this person was allowed to continue to lead, it would have only been worse for his people. We oftentimes think there's justice in bringing down the leadership. But what about like a 3-year-old little girl? You know? Or like an 85, 95-year-old man? I mean, why would you wipe everyone and everything out? This is troublesome, right? I don't fully have the answers for why the entire place needed to be eradicated, other than to say to you, when evil occupies the land, you have to eradicate all of it. And that's what God was doing. He was eradicating evil. And so sometimes in the lower story where we live, there's some things that are just beyond my grasp that I don't fully understand. That is going on in the upper story where God does. But because God has shown himself to be faithful and just in his relationships with humanity, in the places that I can't yet fully understand, I'm going to trust that God knows what God is doing. I'm going to continue to wrestle with this, probably like you are. I'm going to continue to ask God about it. But for the context of understanding what the Israelites did, it was because there was a group of people who occupied the land who were evil all the time. And God said, it is time. Since they will not repent, I will remove them. And that's what he did. I want to close with the final speech that Joshua gives. Joshua gets to the end of his life. All the land has been apportioned. The Israelites are now in the place of promise. It's been 600 years. They've now taken their new digs. And they get to a place where Joshua assembles all the people and he has one final speech. It's kind of like Moses, who had his one final speech. And listen to what he says, bottom of page 100. Then Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned the elders, leaders, judges, and officials of Israel. And they presented themselves before God. And what Joshua does on page 100, and most of page 101, is he goes back and he reviews their entire history. He just walks with them through all the places where God has led them and shown himself to be strong and been faithful to them. And he just reminds them of all the things that they know. And then he says towards the bottom, God says, "So I gave you a land on which you did not toil, in cities you did not build, and you live in them and eat from vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant." That would be called grace. He said, "Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose lands you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Did you catch that just earlier, what I spoke about when he says to them, throw away the gods of your ancestors? They're still carrying around their idols. Really? After all this, they're still carrying around their little trinkets and their little idols. And what it says to me is that our idols are really hard to get rid of sometimes. Even if we are following God or trying to do with our lives. Do you believe that? Did you catch that? And so he said, listen, your entire history has been one of people who are idol worshipers. You have been enslaved for the better part of your entire life. Yahweh, God, the Lord, has provided over and over again. He said, and yet you still carry your little trinkets and your little statues and your little idols, and you worship them as if you think they're going to provide for you something. That's a death trap. He says, so I want you to choose this day who you will serve. And he says, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord, Yahweh, the one and only God. I think to myself about this, and I'm almost incredulous that a group of people who have gone through such things could still find themselves worshiping their idols. And then I realized how hard it is for me to ditch mine. Those places and those people, those things that I, when the rubber meets the road, will sometimes place my trust in over and above God. I wonder today, in this place, for a called out, set apart people who want to express their faith and walk with God in a very true and living way, if there are idols in our lives that we need to look at and ditch. Because you know what? They will stand in the way of God's best for us. You say, well, what kind of idol can I possibly have? You can make an idol out of almost anything. In Egypt, we looked at all their different idols and their gods. You know what? Ours might take a different shape and form, but they take a different shape and form. Some of us have created and made our jobs. We found our identity solely in our jobs. And the way we work at it, one would not have to ask us any questions about what we consider to be the most important thing in our world. Because we work 80 and 90 and 100 hours a day. But we're slaves. Why do we do it? You have to answer the question if you do it. Some of us are chasing the Benjamins. We want more money. We don't think we have enough. We need more. When our bills come in and we find that we have more going out than coming in, we think if we just had more money and we place our trust in George Washington, not in the God who provides for us. We idolize what a bigger bank account would look like, what it would provide for us, what it would do for us, the status it would give us. Some of us idolize our intellect, some of us idolize our looks, and some of us idolize any number of different things. And I just want to say to you, as you think about and look at Joshua 23 and 24, and he has this final speech with his friends, as for you and your house, who's it going to be? They were still carrying around idols after all of that. And so are some of us. Gets to the end, and then it says, Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. It sounds like a good season in the life of Israel. But it kind of leads me to the next question, what's going to happen when Joshua dies out? And that kind of leader is no longer around to set the example. That's where we're going to pick it up next week. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. How about you?
Vincent.
Father, there are places in Joshua that are difficult for us to wrestle with and to reconcile in our head the distinction between what kind of God you are. A loving, kind, gracious, patient one, or a harsh, cruel, mean one. There's some things that we can discern about your justice being meted out against evil. But there's some things that don't make sense for us. I pray that as we wrestle with it, that you would meet us, you would help us understand more about who you are. And as we understand more about who you are and the way that you walk with us and provide for us, that it would change something about the way we are with you. I want to be like Caleb, who as I get older, I only get better. I don't want to get harder and colder and meaner and more afraid. I want to grow in my faithfulness, my courage. And I pray that for us as a people. I ask that when the battle plan doesn't seem to make sense, that you would help us to express faith, not in our own might, but in your might and power. That if you're calling us to step up, that we would move forward and not backward, that we would take on the challenges you prompt us to, that we would watch your arm at work in our lives, and that we would grow our faith because we see your hand so mightily at work. I pray that in this group you would grow us to be a people of faith and a people of courage. And God, I pray that it wouldn't take us 40 years of wandering around in futility, that we would get it sooner than later. That you might lead us into the places of promise that you have intended for us. And I ask all these things in the name of the one who